Good morning, this is Angela with Parker's Hausfrau. If you're new to this channel, I make a video every Friday where I talk about ecological homemaking. I have more than 20 years experience as a professional homemaker, and I unschool my 4 children who are now ages 10 to almost 19. Today I want to talk about my #1 favorite book related to the topic of homemaking. So I hope that you'll hang with me for a few minutes while I go over why I love this book, and I hope at the end of the video, if you haven't read it, you will consider accessing a copy because it is a fabulous read. So the book I want to talk about today is Radical Homemakers, Reclaiming Domesticity from a Consumer Culture by Dr. Shannon Hayes. Now, Shannon Hayes is a professional homemaker, I think in New York State, and her book came out in 2010. When it came out, it was just a breath of fresh air for me. I got my hands on a copy as soon as I could. It was such a really affirming book for me to read. Here is somebody else who lives a life like I live. At the time, I had homeschool mom friends and I had friends who were in the workplace. I didn't have very many friends or very many connections with other people who wanted to be homemaking in the professional sense, who wanted to embrace all of those traditional domestic skills. Oh, my poodle is rolling over here. So I didn't have a lot of friends at the time who were interested in homemaking the same way that I was. I had a lot of friends who were homeschool moms. I was in a homeschool co-op, but they weren't interested in kind of the environmental things I was interested in. They weren't into the traditional domestic arts the way that I was. And I felt really kind of on my own, floating free. Like I don't have a tribe. I don't have a group of folks that I can say, these are my people. And when I read Shannon's book, immediately I was like, here are other people. She talks about her own experience as a homemaker, but she shares the experience of many, many folks that she interviews. I thought, here's folks that are like me, living a life like me, relatively isolated. And how can we all come together and support each other? Her book was such an encouragement to me because I felt like there were other people like me out there and I could connect with them. And in fact, the Portland Radical Homemakers group, which is a Facebook group, it's not very active anymore, started up and we had a few meetings and I met some really lovely people through that group. There are other people in my community right here who are doing the same kind of homemaking I am. And there are folks all over the world that are doing it too. And I felt like Shannon's book helped bring us together. And that's one of the reasons that I love it so much. So one of the things that Shannon talks about in her book is how homemaking is something that is not anachronistic. It's not some 1950s throwback that a few privileged women are living, where we are sitting back with our cocktail in the afternoon on our plastic covered sofa and watching soap operas. She really talks about how homemaking is a highly skilled profession, and she's absolutely right that we have to reclaim those domestic skills that have been lost for a lot of us. Now, I am absolutely lucky and privileged that I was raised by a woman who was a homemaker and had all of those traditional skills, taught many of them to me, and encouraged me to explore and teach myself the skills that she didn't teach to me herself. So I came into homemaking at age 22 with a leg up in many regards. A lot of people have lost these skills and have to relearn them on their own. And so Radical Homemakers was a way to kind of connect people through these radical homemaker groups so that we could kind of teach and support each other and say, absolutely, the work that you want to do is valid. Just because it's not tied to a paycheck, the skills that you want to acquire matter and make a difference for you, for your household, and for your community. And you should be supported in learning those skills, and you should be supported in your chosen vocation. I really love the fact that this book is expressly clear that homemaking is a political act. Homemaking, as Shannon does it and as I do it, is absolutely radical. The book is called Radical Homemakers. It is a rejection of our consumer culture. It is a rejection of the notion that our labor must be tied to a paycheck to be worthy, that the accumulation of money and stuff is the way to happiness. This book talks about how homemaking is a rejection of all of that nonsense. Now, I will say being a professional homemaker is something that takes a measure of privilege. It absolutely does. It's not something that everybody has access to do, and a lot of people want to be able to engage in this vocation and can't full-time. I mean, I also work part-time, so homemaking is really difficult to do full-time. It often takes a supportive partner with a job outside of the home who especially can provide health insurance through their employer. It is something that does take some amount of privilege. It also takes quite a bit of sacrifice, and I don't think that folks should minimize that. If you embrace homemaking, there are so many things about our consumer culture that you must give up in order to do it. I don't see those as necessarily bad, and there's a lot of ways that giving up those things in order to become a homemaker has turned out to be a benefit in the end. And I think that Shannon Hayes talks about that in her book, that the peace of mind that you find, that the fulfillment that you find in being a homemaker absolutely is worth giving up the things that consumer culture tells you have to take. I also think one of the really important things that Shannon Hayes talks about in her book is that homemaking is not just a skill for women. Many of the homemaking books out there are specifically geared toward religious women homemakers. And Shannon Hayes kind of tears that all apart and says, homemaking doesn't have to be religious. It doesn't have to be accessible only to women. It doesn't have to be accessible just to somebody that is a mother. It's not just for religious women with children. Homemaking is something that should be accessible to anybody of any age group. Whether you have children, whether you have a partner, whether you are single, whether you live in a household that is shared by a group of autonomous adults, homemaking should be accessible to you. So no matter your gender or your age, homemaking should be available and accessible to you as a career. And when you take up the mantle of a homemaker, you are somebody who has the ability to make a tremendous positive impact in your community. Shannon Hayes speaks in her book about how homemaking is not just housekeeping and baking. It's not just caring for small children, but if it includes all of those things, those are well and good and valuable and meaningful ways of being. Those are valid ways of living your life and valid skills to take up. Shannon Hayes does a good job in this book striking this balance of talking about the feminism of homemaking. There's been so much rejection by certain feminist circles of folks who want to embrace homemaking and caregiving and child rearing as a job, as a profession. And she does a really good job kind of breaking that down, and then also talking about how homemaking can be a really feminist choice and something that we need to look at as a valid and honorable vocation. Just because it's not tied to a paycheck, it doesn't mean that it is somehow oppressive to women or somehow antiquated or somehow not valuable. And I really love the way that she addresses that in the book. So a huge part of this book is her interviewing lots and lots of people who engage in homemaking. And I love hearing the stories about the things that they do and the traditional skills that they embrace and how homemaking looks different depending on the needs of the individual, the household, and the community. I do appreciate very much the emphasis she puts on how homemakers are available to engage in the work of caregiving, in the work of caring for their communities, being home in their neighborhoods during the day, being accessible in the community, how much of a benefit that brings, and how much our consumer culture devalues the extremely important work of homemaking, and how she would like to elevate that. And not only in the minds of those of us who have been hypercritical of homemaking, but in the culture in general. We can elevate homemaking, we can see the real, true value that it has as a vocation. So I really appreciated all of those things that she talks about. Her book is not so much a set of skills or instruction for housekeeping and domestic arts. It is an encouragement. It is a look at what a modern homemaker is, how we are valuable, intellectual, deep, and multifaceted people, how our work matters and has meaning in our culture, and how our work should be put to the forefront more, should be encouraged. The path of homemaking is something that can lead to tremendous personal fulfillment, but also is something that can push us as a culture toward a more sustainable way of being. And that if we look at the value that homemaking has in our society, we can start to look at the ways that our society is truly unsustainable, not only from an ecological aspect, but from a emotional and psychological aspect, how our culture is so damaging to our communities and to the planet. And we can say maybe homemaking is an answer to that, is a response to that, is a pushback against consumer culture, and how when we embrace homemaking, it can be a threat to our consumer culture, but it really is a response to it. And it really is something that brings meaning to the lives of the folks who do it and brings a benefit to our whole community. That you'll check out Shannon Hayes' book and think about how homemaking is something that helps center our lives around our family, around our local community, and also can bring not only personal fulfillment, but also greater cultural change for the better. If you are interested in supporting this channel, I have a Patreon down in the description, as videos here are not yet monetized. I'll be back next Friday. Thanks.